Hello and welcome to our first episode of the Symphonic podcast. My name is Bernardo Miethe, and with me is Andrew Owen. I've been thinking about doing this podcast for about a year now. I listen to a lot of podcasts on my free time, and I decided to do something in the same veins of Stuff You Should Know, the Stuff You Should Know podcast. And my idea is to have one major work a week or one major composer a week and talk about it, discuss it a little bit. And my idea is to appeal to musicians and non-musicians alike. Also, I want to make sure that we can embed some musical examples in the video, but I realized that even though the music is copyright, it's in the public domain, most of the recordings are still copyrighted, so we're gonna have to do some, we're probably gonna have to just insert 15-second examples. Who am I? My name is Bernardo Miethe, as I said in the beginning. I am originally from Venezuela, and that's why I have an accent.
What accent?
And I've been studying music since I was 9 years old. I have a bachelor's in flute performance, a master's in band conducting, and now in a month from tomorrow, I'll be getting my DMA in orchestral conducting with a minor in choral conducting. So Andrew, tell us about yourself.
And I'm Andrew Owen. I am a musicology graduate student here at LSU. I should hopefully have a doctorate within the next decade. That's just the way these things tend to go. But I am a graduate student in music history. I'm an amateur linguist, an advocate for the Esperanto language and Greg shorthand. I'm a Mississippian originally. Before I came to Louisiana, I lived in Mississippi, born and raised there. You can probably tell from my thick accent that I am from Mississippi, a wonderful place, a place that I call home, my people. But yeah, my emphasis is in music and intersections with occult organizations, esoteric organizations. That's the subject of my dissertation, which is right now in its early stages. But I'm looking forward to this podcast. It'll be lots of fun.
I agree. Let me check my recording thing. It's paused, but it's okay. We'll use the audio from the camera there at the beginning. And let me take this thing off because I'm burning up, dude.
Are you nervous?
I'm already sweating, dude.
Well, I can turn the air down more if you like.
Oh, don't worry about it. In this first episode, my idea was to talk about the role of the conductor and also a little bit maybe about the history of the conductor and maybe the baton as well. So the conductor is a very peculiar art because the conductor doesn't produce any kind of sounds. The conductor is there obviously to unify musical ideas. And the music is very inexact in its writing, right? Even though composers can be very specific at times, there's still a lot of room for interpretation. So the conductor has to make some decisions in terms of tempo, phrasing, and dynamics, and a million other things. In terms of music, a phrase, what's a musical phrase? Well, what's a phrase, first of all? The Oxford Dictionary defines a phrase as, quote, a small group of words standing together as a conceptual unit, typically forming a component of a clause, end quote. That means that it's a smaller unit within a larger structure, right? And I feel like in music is almost the same. The Oxford Music Online defines a musical phrase as, quote, short section of a composition into which the music seems naturally to fall. It is an inexact term. Sometimes a phrase may be contained within one breath, and sometimes subdivisions may be marked. In notation, phrase marks are the slurs placed over or under the notes as a hint to their proper punctuation in performance. The art of phrasing by a performer is often instinctive and is one of the features by which a supreme artist might be distinguished from a lesser inspiration, end quote. So This end clause is very important because it also leaves a lot of room for interpretation, right?
Yep.
That a performer can make his own decisions in terms of phrasing. Andrew, anything
Well,
like
yeah,
that?
I mean, a phrase is, if we were going to compare a symphonic work to a spoken paragraph, a phrase is a thought. A phrase is something that tends to begin quiet and then then have some kind of main nugget, and that sort of usually fades off into the end. Like the sentence I just said started out pretty quietly, unassumingly, and then got to what I really wanted to say, and then sort of disappeared into the very end of the sentence. This is something that is natural in language and something that music, quite early on, started to imitate. And that's where we find instrumental music, especially in the Romantic era, starting to try to imitate the nature of natural spoken speech. Of course, so does rhetoric, and so does things from the classical and Baroque era, certainly. And these are all specific terms. If you're unfamiliar with the terms of music, you'll be fine. Eras of music history. But to say that symphonic music has phrases is just saying that it's trying to get a thought across, be it something related to a real something that you can touch or not. I think that's really what a phrase is. A conductor has a choice of how he can make those phrases happen. That's where a lot of his authority, his or her authority, goes into his job or her job.
So I wrote a little bit about how to become a conductor. So obviously a musician, if you're a musician and you want to be a conductor, there are some things that you should obviously know. One of the most important ones is score reading. All of us trained musicians are usually, well, not choir musicians, but all the other musicians, performers, are usually just accustomed to read one line of music, right? Well, you do because you are a special case, but
When I sing in choirs, I read from a part, but that's just my own little fun game that I play with myself.
yes.
But generally, choirs do read from scores. That's
Exactly.
quite common these days.
So as I said, most musicians are used to read one line at a time, I guess. And to become a conductor, you have to read multiple lines at a time, and actually a lot of lines at the time. So that takes a lot of practice. But I mean, it's just practice. Once you kind of understand where things are placed and all that, you can kind of read it pretty straight through once you get some practice. Obviously, a conductor needs to have problem-solving skills. My favorite conductors are those that come prepared way before the rehearsal even starts. They already know things that might be a problem in the future, and they are prepared to rehearse those before those even happen. Obviously, a conductor has to have very great communication skills. And there is another thing about conducting that can be very tricky, and it's some sort of like a balance. Something that my professor Carlos Duracello, he calls that conducting. He says that conducting is a balance between precision and expression, and this is certainly true because some of the most professional orchestras or ensembles, they usually have a conductor that it's hard to follow, I guess.
Always.
And he's trying to, I guess, get everybody to listen to each other, and he's probably trying to just convey the overall music idea instead of the what's happening in this exact second. And then we have the other side, which is precision, and this is most usually you see this most usually in, I guess, more amateur examples, but of course they're not mutually exclusive. People like Kurt Masur, he's extremely precise and he's an extremely great conductor.
Sure.
So we have obviously all ranges of this kind of balance.
So I think Stephen Kleeberry also falls into the category of a very good musician, good conductor who is extremely precise on where the beat is. And then you have other conductors who are very imprecise. A lot of range.
Lot of range. So I wanted to talk also a little bit about maybe the history of conducting and the baton as well. So in the early 19th century, there were many different styles of conducting practice at the time. We had the audible beaters, which you probably use like a large stick to beat the tact. We also had some instrumentalists maybe giving some entrances with their bows or from the piano. We also had some conductors using a rolled up piece of paper and giving also the beat to start a piece. And so at this time there were a lot of experiments being made. Also like where the conductor should stand, where should it face, and all this stuff. These experiments were being made in the early 19th century. So at this time, and you probably know a lot more than me about this. These are changing times in the world, especially in Europe. We're moving from patrons to the public
Yes.
consumption of music, right? So the middle class is starting to perform more of the music, and so composers are composing not only for patrons but also for the public. So this makes their job a little more difficult, because they could have before this they could have just told them verbally how to perform something, but now they're adding more details so that amateurs can perform this, like more dynamics, more tempo markings, and more all these expressive markings,
Sure,
stuff like that.
Really not until the 19th century that you have composers writing in the score how the performer should feel, rather than how the performer should perform it. This is where we have the beginning of people writing espressivo. Before the 19th century, I mean, what does expressive mean? Expressive just means express something. It's kind of hard. So what they do in the 19th century, more than in any time past, is they really want to get in the head of the performer, try to make sure that the performer has the composer whispering into his ear more and more with these little phrases in the score. Conductors can take advantage of this in the 19th century, more so than in prior centuries.
Of course, and this also leaves kind of a performance practice kind of gray area, because now a lot of Mozart, a lot of Beethoven is conducted, right? And
Sure.
at that time, I mean, Mozart, the symphonies of Mozart were never conducted. So how do we how do we replicate this music? So if you want to go all the way, if you want to make not only musical, if you want to recreate not only music but also all the aspects, I guess we have to use wooden flutes, brass instruments without valves, and no conductor, right? But not a lot of people do that these days. I mean, we have to take advantage, I guess, of the modern instruments, and that's a topic for another day. How do we decide what to recreate and what not to recreate?
Sure, the large orchestra is something that is very foreign to Mozart.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're wanting to do something period informed about Mozart, you have to use old instruments, and very few of them, and the conducting, the cues, all those things have to be given by someone like the first violinist, the very first person up there that gives a nod or does something.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, in the 19th century, near the late part of the 19th century, a lot of Verdi's, I remember looking at lots of Verdi printed parts and found that the first violin part in Verdi operas tended to have not just the first violin part, but also cues for all of the other parts.
Nice.
So the violinist would know where to look at certain points. The violinist would look up. So got it.
Awesome.
So those were the expectations in those days too.
Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, at this time, from the time of Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, we see an increase in the ensemble. I guess the ensembles are just getting bigger. We're adding more instruments and more of them, and so we needed a way. I guess they needed a way to make sure that everybody was together. So this is when where the idea of the conductor starts to rise. Of course, like you said, before this, chamber groups were really used to just giving a nod, looking at each other and stuff like that. But now, I mean, with all these people playing at the same time, it's kind of hard, I guess.
Harder and harder. Sound doesn't travel as fast as light does. That's just one of those things. I don't know if that's really that true for such a small space as an orchestra holds, but there is something to say about sound traveling to the back of the hall and back to you. There might be just enough delay that eventually everyone starts getting out of sync with each other.
And also, I mean, if I'm playing over here in the first violins and we have a horn that's very far away, you have all this sound from the strings next to you, but you really can't hear. You probably can't hear what maybe some other instruments, or maybe it's more realistic to say that the horns can't hear the first violins. So because of this, it's also a good idea, I guess, to make sure that everybody's together. So we have some examples before the rise of the conductor, like Lully, who is said to have died, I guess.
Yeah, it was 1687. He died in, well, he was conducting with a very large stick and had a self-inflicted wound to his foot, which eventually led to his death in March of that year. It was gangrene. It was pretty bad. Despite the work of several doctors, they were unable to save him. But that's an unfortunate time in history. But it does call to mind the fact that people did mark the tact, what they call the taktus, the beat. They marked that at those times with a very loud, audible beat, especially during rehearsals. I imagine they wouldn't use it during the actual performance. Though we do have people who wrote treatises at the time who say that it is a distracting thing in performances to have the beats audible. So people probably did use those things. But
Yeah.
But yeah, so Lully is an early 17th century example of the use of a tactus, or a large stick beating on the ground.
And this tradition of the timekeeper, this continued in the French opera until the 19th century. So I also want to talk a little bit about the baton. So a staff, right, is a symbol of power. Like the bishop or the pope, they hold the staff, right? It's, I guess, a symbol of power.
The shepherd watches over his flock with power.
So we have some treatises from the 16th century that give instruction on how to mark the tactus. Some writers complain about the loudness, like you said, and some other writings from also the 16th century indicate that the strong beat is also called the downbeat because the hand moves down. And then the weak beat is the upbeat because the hand moves up. So here we start to see some indication of how to conduct. Anything from there? Okay, so some French writers say that the Italians use the up and down beats, but the French additionally use some side-to-side movement as well. In talking about the maces. So drum majors in the 17th century, they used also like a mace to lead the marching bands at this time. In 1701, the lexicographer Thomas Janauka, I don't know how to say that, Janauka
Janauka is how I do
Janauka, I guess. He describes the tactus of an ordinary measure as down, left, right, and up, which is something that we are still using.
It becomes really easy because if you see that, then you and you get off by a beat looking at your score or looking at your part, and you look up and your conductor's just doing up and down, then it would be really helpful if you had something to let you know where 2 and 3 are falling with that left and right motion that sets the downbeat and something really obvious.
Yeah, and
really handy.
As you become a trained musician, this becomes almost second nature. When you're looking at a conductor, I mean, you're just reading your part and you can see where the left and the right is out of the corner of your eye, and you know exactly where you should be at the same time. So in 18th century choral music, a rolled up piece of paper was used to beat the large choral groups, and
to beat time for them.
To beat time, exactly.
If you beat the choruses, they get upset.
Nice. So all these ideas, we have the rolled up piece of paper, we have the instrumental conductor, we have the time beater. All these ideas are starting to converge in the 19th century. A little side note, even Beethoven's symphonies, I read last night, were started by instrumentalists, and they would let the entire orchestra play the whole movement. That must have been really hard.
Fewer instruments on the stage for Beethoven's orchestra than we would expect for something like Berlioz or Mahler or something. Just a little group of musicians. So you can usually get it started and they can see the bows going up and down okay. And you can make heads or tails of it, but...
Yeah, sure, but we are still... conductors everywhere are still struggling with the beginning of the Fifth Symphony. How do you start that? It's such a I mean, it's such a mess sometimes.
A lot of conductors I see when they start Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the da 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 is the famous one everyone knows, is they write their name in cursive in the air and then do that. So da 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 da, and then it comes like 5 seconds later. I don't know how they figured that stuff out, but they do.
That's awesome. I mean, in terms of that you were saying that, we have, I mean, much has been said about Herbert von Karajan, and how he is based, I mean, he's conducting with his eyes closed, right? And how can they follow him? He's doing all these things, and you usually hear the orchestra a little behind, actually. And that's still going on today with a lot of conductors. So how do they even know? They're not even, I guess they're not looking at the conductor.
I guess the same way Beethoven's orchestras knew the stuff.
Yes, and
So
I mean,
feel it out.
I guess that nowadays the idea of the instrumental conductor is still being used in those kind of situations where the musicians are forced to listen to each other and they're forced to look at each other while the conductor is here doing all these crazy movements. I guess. I mean, but I respect, of course.
Of course.
I respect and love Karajan. Don't get me wrong. So, there are many stories about the first use of the baton. We have Haydn in the Creation. I mean, these are legends, of course. We don't know if this actually happened. Haydn in the first performance of the Creation using a baton. We have Ignaz Franz Mosel in 1812. We also have Johann Reichardt and Daniel Turk in 1810. And one of these most famous stories is that of Louis Spohr, who supposedly introduced the baton in 1820 while conducting his second symphony. But there's a lot of conflicting evidence that this actually happened.
Spohr was a superstar. He was one of those early virtuoso guys that really really put the orchestra out there. He was one of Beethoven's rivals. But he did use a baton, they say. He was one of the first people to use it in 1820, which was 7 years before Beethoven died.
Mm-hmm.
So this was about that time, early 19th century.
And also, on the other hand, we have actually some recorded evidence from the press that Mendelssohn used a baton in 1829. I mean, either way, we know that it's probably in the 1820s, either Mendelssohn or could have been Spohr.
Yeah, Mendelssohn was the star of conducting between 1820 and 30, just for his. I mean, he was extremely precise. There were all these people who were writing about the way Mendelssohn conducted. He was a superstar. They described his conducting as electric liquid, which I think is kind of, I don't know, trippy for pre-electricity Europe, certainly, but it's really neat how people really thought of Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy as a real go-getter for orchestral conducting.
Yeah.
Though he probably used a baton, I would think he would have. It's just probably not as exuberant as Mahler later on would be, or Bernstein.
Of course. So at the same time, in the early 19th century, people like von Weber, they were leading rehearsals. So they were actually, the art of conducting is kind of being established a little bit. So the baton is being introduced, and then people like von Weber, they're leading rehearsals. And one of the important things about von Weber is that his way of organizing rehearsals is very legendary. I mean, his orchestras would sound earlier in rehearsals, in terms of rehearsal. In 1812, he's said to have accomplished in 3 rehearsals what would have been very difficult to do in 6. So he's organizing rehearsals, to make sure that we're hitting the hard passages first and maybe running or something, running the piece.
Yeah.
And he would be with a rolled up piece of paper. And it is said that he would start with the rolled up, beating the time, and then he would just let the orchestra play the rest. Then we have in the 1820s Gaspare Spontini. Gaspare
Spontini.
Nice. And he is said to be one of the first dictator conductors. So he would still fear and discipline to make the orchestras, play better. And I mean, of course, this happened a lot. This still happens today, but I mean, I think that these days it's happening less and less. I mean,
sure.
Conductors are trying to be more, nice.
This is a good thing.
Oh yes, for sure.
Turns out being mean often makes people worse at their instruments because they freak out. You know, I mean, as a horn player in undergrad, I was a person who knew very well if the conductor even looked at me in the eye before I came in, I wasn't coming in. I mean, just sort of the fear and intimidation factor of conducting is not as popular today as it probably was in the early 20th century. But yeah, Spontini was in the 1820s the first person known for being dictatorial, for being a bit of a tyrant on the podium.
Mm-hmm. And so we already talked about Mendelssohn, but of course we can't talk about Mendelssohn without talking about Wagner. So we have the ideas of Mendelssohn's, which are precision and all these things that you said. He's the rock star conductor, but in the other hand, we have Wagner, who he went against Mendelssohn, which pretty much everything else said that Mendelssohn said. So everything that Mendelssohn said, he was wrong in terms of, in the eyes of Wagner. So he wrote that conducting should be about putting your own emotion and interpretation into the music. And Mendelssohn, he wanted to bring out the composer's ideas out of the music. So we have two very different sides of conducting. One is personal expression with Wagner, and the other one is precision in terms of what the composer wanted. And there's still debate on what we as conductors should do these days. There is so much range in terms of conducting.
Mendelssohn was very backward looking. He was a person who really wanted to respect the art of the composer's craft, simply because he was the guy that revived Johann Sebastian Bach. Before Mendelssohn, if you said Bach, people all thought you were talking about Bach's son Emanuel Bach. Mm-hmm. He was the guy that really made Bach important for people. But he was a person who really respected the composer's art as something that should be saved and brought out, whereas Wagner was really way more about letting your own inner pathos show in the music, which is interesting, because orchestra was Wagner's instrument. That was what he really excelled in. His operas aren't about the voice; they're about the orchestra, pretty much exclusively. So that really does put emphasis on the person in front of this giant orchestra that Wagner uses in his operas, music dramas he called them, because all of that personal expression has to go into one person, the conductor, and then they have to follow it.
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk a little more about that in a second. So Bernstein wrote that the ideal in his what's his name of this book? Let me just make sure that I get. Oh yes, the joy of music. Bernstein wrote a book.
It's happy little book, isn't it?
Yes. And so he wrote there that the ideal conductor should be a combination of both of these, which is rarely achieved. He writes that this is rarely achieved, and it's virtually impossible to combine both at the same time, but that both of them should be present in a conductor's, point of view.
Sort of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde model. It kind of works, I guess.
So Andrew, you have been conducted by a lot of people, and so I just want to know your opinion on conductors. Just be candid. You're not going to offend me. So
it's okay.
Go ahead. Tell me.
I never offend anyone, I promise. Okay, I offend people all the time. No, it's I don't know. How do I feel about conductors? Certain people need them. Certain orchestras need them. Orchestras generally need them. Choirs often need them, though not always. I think if you have under 30 singers, under 40 singers, you really probably don't even need much of anybody in front of them, as long as they can hear where they're going. Mm-hmm. The music gets complicated if that's the case, then it's not the case. I think early music probably needs conductors less, because there's less rubato before the 19th century. Rubato is when tempos go back and forth between fast and slow. It's sort of a gradual thing. You rob time away to give it back at the end. So to make music expressive in the 19th century, people tended to not keep music in time. The tempo wasn't exact. Whereas before that, like Baroque music, almost everything was a dance. So you just had to stay in the right time. So you don't need the conductor as much in Baroque as you do in the 19th century. But I don't know, as a person who's been under lots of conductors, I guess more singing and choirs, when it comes to the balance between his own expression or her own expression and the accuracy of the composer, I've always sided with Mendelssohn. I think it's really fun, not to deify or not to make the composer this amazing person, but just to make the music really, to show expertness about the music. Because generally the composer does know pretty well what he wants.
Yeah.
And I think that personal expression is good as long as it doesn't negate the composer's intention. That tends to be what I find
That's a great point.
in composer and in conductors that like to interpret things to the extent that it's all about them and not about everyone.
That's a great point. I really like that point. So one of my opinions in terms of conductors is that, I mean, conductors tend to be pretentious sometimes. You know, they tend to think that everything is about them, and that's something that I really, I mean, I'm against that. I think that, I mean, I think that, I mean, I conduct very expressively, but I only do it to make sure that the musicians can, to try to bring out more of the music in them. But I don't do it for, I guess, the show of it. And I mean, in terms of conducting, so I try to, I guess, be a little bit of a show off, just a little bit,
Of course.
so that they can, in turn, transmit that to the audience. Because I mean, the other thing is that I don't like is I don't like watching going to an orchestral concert and watching all these musicians playing. I mean, they play perfectly, but they play like they're bored. You know, they're playing like and everything's perfect. But I mean, it doesn't tell me anything, right?
Sure.
To me, I really like to see when they are really getting into the actual music. Obviously, I mean, there has to be reverence to the composer, but I mean, there's music beyond the music, in my
Sure.
opinion. So I guess.
I think it's all about the music. I mean, it's all about what the music does to everyone. Whenever music becomes about one person, it seems sort of weird to me.
Mm-hmm.
I guess because I'm very much an early music person,
Mm-hmm.
where really before the 19th century, the composer was not this artist demigod.
See, yeah.
He was a worker, a person who made music for everyone to enjoy, to consume. You didn't want to hear the struggle of the composer in his music in the classical era any more than you wanted to taste the struggle of your chef in your food. It makes no sense, you know.
True.
It's like, oh, this tastes horrible, you know. No, I mean, it should never be about ego. It should never be about what an artist I am or what an artist any one person is. But I think music is designed as a community thing, and I think the nice thing about conductors is that it's a bit like John Locke and social contract and all that stuff. We have all decided that one person needs to keep us in time,
Yeah.
and one person needs to have basic ideas as to how we need to present our music. But it's not because we worship this man or woman.
Yeah, and I also think that as a conductor, you should never negate other people's ideas. I mean, if somebody comes to me, if a musician comes to me and tells me about, hey, I think that this phrase should be done this way, and if there is a good reason for it, yes, I mean, I guess we can all agree with that. I mean, it doesn't have to be, it's my idea and it's only my idea and you guys are not going to contribute to this music. So I think, I mean, it's community, right?
Oh yeah.
Is there anything else you want to say?
I'm good.
Cool. Okay, so we reached the final. We've reached the end of our first podcast. It's been a lot of fun. So if there's anything that you want to maybe add to this conversation, you can, I guess, post it in the comments or email us. And if there's anything that we maybe got completely wrong, we'll amend it in maybe the next video. I'll add a little bit about something that we got wrong in case we did.
Oh, sure.
And
We love being corrected. It means that we're getting closer to the truth.
Very nice. Very nice. And well, I guess we'll see you in our next episode.
Yes. Thanks for listening or
Thank you.
watching.